Hey everyone, Tactics here with a couple more new raid bosses from 9.1 Sanctum of Domination, this time the second last boss, KelThuzad, as well as one of the earlier bosses in Eye of the Jailer. I'll be taking a look at the heroic versions of both bosses as they were during testing, and giving my thoughts on them with more detailed boss guides coming closer to 9.1's release, when all of the abilities are ironed out and confirmed. I do also stream all these testings over on my Twitch at Tactics, as well as things like high mythic plus keys and mythic rating from a tank's perspective, so if that interests you, feel free to come and check it out, linked in the description below. With all that said, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and let's start off with the penultimate boss, Kel'Thuzad. Now this boss is actually extremely cool, with all of his mechanics ramping up over the course of the fight, concluding with an intense and chaotic burn phase. The fight essentially bounces between two phases, one where you're fighting Kel'Thuzad himself, and another where some of your raid goes into his phylactery to fight a remnant, while the rest stay outside and kill some ads. In the Kel'Thuzad phase, there's a ton of stuff players need to deal with, including silence fields that drop on a couple players, a frost blast that targets a single player and has to be soaked, as well as glacial spikes that you have to kill off in a staggered fashion to avoid getting too many stacks of the raid-wide dot they apply. To make this even more difficult, the spikes themselves have health decay over time, putting you in a situation where you want to quickly kill some off while leaving others untouched so you don't kill your raid. KT also summons fairly unimpactful ads in this phase, which just fixate a target and deal AoE damage if they reach them. For the most part though, these can just be kited through or gripped into melee and then just cleaved down. An interesting quirk of this fight though is that whenever KT summons ads in both this and the intermission phase or phase 2, any currently dead players are also resurrected and mind controlled, making dying on this fight extremely punishing. On top of this, the boss will intermittently summon ice patches across the room that slowly grow over time, eventually exploding after 20 seconds, dealing near lethal frost damage to anyone inside of them, meaning the raid needs to kind of find a safe spot, sit in the gap, and wait out the explosions. The tank debuff in this phase is also kind of interesting, splitting the current tank's soul into 3 different ads around the room and causing them to take 500% more increased physical damage until they regain all 3 fragments of their soul, which are dropped when these ads are killed. If they're unable to do so within a minute, they'll instantly die, so your DPS, especially range, need to be sure to swap these ads to get them down quickly. Luckily, all of these ads have fairly low health, and while they do chain cast an interruptible raid-wide shadow damage hit, they usually don't live very long if just a couple DPS swap to them. On top of this, the silence fields that I previously mentioned can actually be dropped on top of these ads, and it does also silence them, so players can drop these nearby and these ads will just never cast. Once you actually reduce KT to 0 HP, that's when phase 2 starts. He becomes untargetable and just channels its lethal raid-wide hit. To prevent it from going off, you just need to send some people into the phylactery, which is near the front of the room. You just get an extra action button, you can interact with it, and it takes them to this small platform with a remnant, and basically you just have to deal 33% of its HP before KT outside finishes his cast, all the while just kind of dodging these fissures that go on the ground, blasts of ice, and even tornadoes in the final remnant phase. This ad is untankable though, so you don't need a tank, you just need a few DPS and a healer. This is probably going to vary depending on raid size and difficulty. On the heroic, we sent in 4 DPS and a healer, and it was more than enough damage. You do need the healer though, because everyone is taking increasing ticking damage the longer you're down there. Outside during this time, there's just a bunch of ads you want to kill off before the phylactery group finishes, because when the phase transitions, KelThuzad will buff any living ads. So basically you just want to have enough DPS balanced out so you kill the ads maybe just a little bit before your remnant group kills their or gets their remnant down to the correct HP threshold. So this means that you'll need to actually push KT 3 times. So kill him a total of 3 times so you can deal 33% of the remnant's HP each time before you actually enter the final burn phase. The interesting thing about this fight though is that every time KelThuzad resurrects, he gains a stacking buff that increases his damage and causes 1 additional glacial spike and silence field to go out. On heroic, he started with 2 of each on pull, meaning he would ramp up to 5 of each during the final burn phase, making this fight extremely difficult as you kill KT more times, requiring a lot of controlled coordination and damage. Overall, this fight gets absolutely crazy, and I really do love it. There's a lot going on for every role, and I'm really excited to see how this fight ends up changing on Mythic. The other boss we tested alongside KelThuzad was Eye of the Jailer, which unfortunately I didn't actually get to do too many pulls on as I had to go to my own raid. Though the fight isn't too complex, which makes sense seeing as it's likely the second or third boss in the raid. So a good comparable in Castle Nathria would be something like Huntsman Altamore. Similar to KelThuzad, this fight bounces between a phase where you're fighting the boss itself and a phase where you deal with just 2 smaller adds before culminating in a burn phase. The main difference here though is that there's a lot less going on in the boss phases that you can mess up to wipe your raid. For the boss phase, there's some swirlies you'll want to dodge, then there's a chain soak mechanic on a random player that you want several people to be in so they can drag down the ad that is holding the chains onto the platform. The less people that soak, the harder this pull affects the players, so if you don't want your friends to be yoinked off the edge of the platform, be sure several people are in these. The ad itself isn't really dangerous, it does need to be tanked, but it can just be brought on top of the boss and cleaved down. Once you've actually returned to the boss phase for the first time, he'll occasionally do a beam sweep across the entire platform, which will kill players hit. It's possible to blink or immunity to get your way through this, but if you don't have those kind of tools, there are chain piles at each end of the platform that you can interact with to kind of send yourself across the gap to safety. The tank debuff is similar to Frida's Soul Spikes from Castle Nathria's Council of Blood, if you're familiar, where it just causes damage taken by the active tank to radiate to the rest of the raid. Outside of this though, there really isn't a ton of tank damage going out, so this likely won't really be an issue to deal with, as tanks can actually just stack up their DRs to drastically reduce this incoming damage. In the intermission phase, there's 2 eyes that spawn, 1 on each platform. You want to tank them separately too, so basically you can have range in the middle and they can cleave, and then you'll want to split up your melee so you have even damage on each side. And you'll just tank them there because if they're close by, I believe it's 30 yards, they'll start doing pulsing raid-wide damage. And I believe when one of them dies, the other will also be doing pulsing raid-wide damage, so you want to kind of kill them evenly again. They do drop permanent puddles on the ground as well, so you want to try and tank him towards the edges of the platform rather than the middles, just to kind of drop puddles in like an even line just to maximize your space, as you will have to do this a total of 3 times. So you go into this intermission phase 3 times, so you want to make sure you have enough space for your raid before entering the burn stage of the boss. Speaking of the burn phase, at 25% HP, the boss goes into overdrive, gaining stacking attack speed, raid-wide shadow damage, and a stacking healing reduction until death. This is definitely going to be the best place for Lust, and just nuke the boss down before your raid gets overwhelmed. And in general, the fight in total is fairly simple, nothing too complex going on. It should shape up to be one of the easier bosses in the raid, in my opinion. But that does wrap up the second day of raid testing for 9.1 Sanctum of Domination. Overall, I'd say we've got a couple really cool bosses so far, with Guardian of the First Ones and Kel'Thuzad, followed by a couple more simplistic bosses with the Terragru and Eye of the Jailer, though when you look at boss positioning in the raid, that makes a lot of sense, with the simpler bosses being the first few you actually encounter, and the more complex ones being right near the end. Remember though guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to drop a like and subscribe to the channel to be notified when I post more 9.1 content. I'll also be streaming all things World of Warcraft over on my Twitch at Tactics, so feel free to drop by, say hi, and hang out. That's all for now though. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.